If you are like me, then you probably know that you sin every day. But if you are like me, you also probably find it difficult to pinpoint exactly when or what you're doing when you're sinning. So at the end of the day, I basically say, well, I was probably prideful today, or I, was probably self-absorbed at some point. But I don't really spend too much time thinking about I did this, this, and this, and I should confess this, this, and this. Because maybe I didn't outright lie to someone, or hurt someone, or covet something. So I'm just like, oh, sure, yeah, I sin every day. Because if I didn't raise my hand if that question was asked, then I would look like a bad Christian because I don't admit to my sin. But I'm here today to tell you that you probably sin way more than you realize, which is a delightful topic, so let's get into it. So let's talk a little bit about what sin is exactly. So I propose to you that sin is not just acting against God's will, because I don't believe a lot of us go through the train of thought that says, well, I know God doesn't want me to do this, but I'm going to do it anyway. I would say most people probably don't have that thought. I would say sin is not just acting against God's will, but it's not even acknowledging that God is there. It's not even acknowledging that He has a will for you, or that He has something He wants you to do. When we sin, we aren't thinking about God most of the time, unless we're just absolutely like, yep, I acknowledge you're God, you're there, but I'm going to do my own way. I would propose you probably don't go through that often. So knowing that sin is not just doing bad things, sin is not thinking about God at all. And there's a term for this, and it's called ungodliness. So when I think of ungodliness, I think of those people who are without God, those unbelievers that live in direct opposition to God through all of their choices. But you don't really think of yourself as a Christian, which I assume you are. I don't really know what the viewership demographic is, but I'm assuming you're a Christian. And since you are a Christian, I'm assuming you probably don't put yourself in that without God, ungodly category. But let me read a definition of ungodliness that I really took to heart, and it's by Jerry Bridges, who's my favorite author. He says that ungodliness may be defined as living one's everyday life with little or no thought of God, or of God's will, or of God's glory, or of one's dependence on God. I'm going to continue with his thoughts in this further quote. Now, the sad fact is that many of us who are believers tend to live our daily lives with little or no thought of God. We may even read our Bibles and pray for a few minutes at the beginning of each day, but then we go out into the day's activities and basically live as though God doesn't exist. We seldom think of our dependence on God or our responsibility to Him. We might go for hours or days with no thought of God at all. In that sense, we are hardly different from our nice, decent, but unbelieving neighbor. God is not at all in His thoughts, but is seldom in ours. And that's the end of the quote. So when I first read that, I was like, oh, that really hit me, because you think of sin as, just not doing what God wants you to, or doing what He doesn't want you to. But He's defining ungodliness as any time you are living your life as though you're pretending God isn't there, or that He doesn't care about what you're doing, which I would say is probably more of the time than I would like to admit. How obvious is it to others that I have God in my life? Basically, every time you make a decision or do an action without thinking or acknowledging God's sovereignty and lordship over you, you are being ungodly. So with this definition, you can basically attribute every other sin to ungodliness. Like I said, if you were even thinking about God or what His will for you when you're about to do something, you probably wouldn't sin in the first place. And that's why this author basically says that ungodliness can be the root of all sin. So now that I've spent enough time attempting to convict you of your sin and making you feel bad about yourself, let's not dwell on the fact that we often really suck at being godly. Let's ask the question, how does one practice godliness? Obviously, we don't want to be ungodly, but we need to acknowledge that we are. How do you do all things for the glory of God, as it says in 1 Corinthians 10:31? I would offer two questions for you. Is God pleased with the way you go about doing ordinary activities? Because you could say that, well, most of the stuff I do is pretty mundane and God wouldn't care about it. Like studying for physics or eating food. But honestly, Colossians says that whatever you eat or drink or whatever you do to the glory of God. So even in those mundane activities, you can still glorify God and acknowledge Him. Let me give you like a really quick example of a way to tell someone who's ungodly versus someone who is godly and is thinking about God. So you walk outside and you say, wow, it's a really beautiful day outside. Which there's nothing wrong with that, and props to you for acknowledging beauty, because I honestly struggle with that. But then someone else looks at the same thing and says, wow, God made a beautiful day. And it's really simple and really subtle, but you can tell that that person is either looking at creation and being reminded of God, or that God is already in his thoughts as he walks through his day. And that might seem really small, but it's a mindset of how you approach your work, how you approach doing the mundane things, because 99% of your life is doing mundane things. And that's how you could tell someone who's ungodly versus godly. So godliness is something you practice, and I believe that to help you, start practicing to be godly, it's all about thankfulness, because the more you thank, the more you're thinking about God anyway. So that's like one helpful tip. Honestly, I can't say, okay, now that you've learned this lesson, go and think every minute, every day about God, because that's not unreasonable, but it's something we physically can't do. But I would say that the more you reflect on what sin is, and seeing that even not thinking about God is sin, and the more you realize you are really corrupt, and you are still, sin has power over you, the more you realize the depth of your sin, the more grateful you're going to be for the salvation that you have. And so that is something that I would pose to you, is just spend a little bit of time thinking about, wow, am I ungodly? Try to not necessarily quantify how many minutes of the day that I think about God, but just spend time meditating on, do I think about God? Is it obvious to others that I'm a Christian by the way that I eat, drink, go about my daily life? So I just want to end with a little piece of encouragement, because obviously that's kind of weighty, but knowing that godliness is a really high standard, obviously. But the point is that we will fail when we try to do it on our own. And what I would ask for you to do is to seek God every day, and not only seek Him, but seek His help and ask Him for desire to be godly, and ask Him for His help every day, because the more we acknowledge our dependence on Him, the closer we'll be to godliness.